And welcome back to another podcast with Mr. Hagan. On this Econ podcast, we're going to continue to talk about the idea of externalities. And we're going to specifically talk about negative externalities, which we did talk about on a previous video a little bit. But so what we're going to do now is we're going to lay out the concept again, and then we're going to move the concept onto a graph and look at how economics think about externalities and how we can solve externality problems. So just as a review, a negative externality is a spillover cost harming non-consenting third parties, people who are not involved in a trade. And so over here, just very quickly, here's a trade that's happening where some company is producing some good called widgets, and they sell the widgets to customers. So the customer is paying money to the company, and the company is providing them with widgets. And so from their point of view, this trade's all good. They just look at the benefits and costs they get from engaging in the trade, but they do not consider the non-consenting third-party costs over here. So there's some non-consenting third party who suffers as a result of this trade. So when these guys trade the widgets, some of the pollution comes over here and makes this guy sick, and he has to go to the doctor and he has to pay for that. And these guys did not take that into account. And so as a result of that, the trade, for the people who are involved in the trade, the benefit outweighs the cost of the trade, or else it wouldn't happen. But they're not taking the negative externalities into account. They're not considering this guy over here who is suffering as a result and having to go to the doctor and so forth. And so for society as a whole, we said that it could be that the cost of this trade that's happening over here, the costs of the trade outweigh the benefits for society as a whole, but it still happens, and this is what we said is inefficient, and that's a market failure. So the question is, what does this look like on a graph? So let's work through it. So here we have the quantity of widgets right here on the horizontal axis. We have the price of widgets on the vertical. This is the supply curve of widgets, and notice here that I have this P here. That's going to be important. That's going to be the private supply curve. I'll say that again here in a second. And then we have the demand curve for widgets, and then there's an equilibrium quantity, equilibrium price, all the normal stuff. Now, I said that this P here stands for private. This is the private supply curve. That is the people who are internal to the trade. The people internal to the trade. That was, if I go back to our picture real fast, that's these guys. That's the customer and the company. They are internal to the trade. Those are the guys that are internal to the trade. And then this guy, he's the guy that is external to the trade. So the people internal to the trade, that's the private supply curve for the company that is providing the widgets, and then this is the demand curve for the customer. Now, we need to think about a separate supply curve, because this supply curve, the social supply curve, that's what the supply curve would be if they took the external costs into account. If they took the external costs into account. So you can think of the supply curve as a cost curve, and these were the private costs of producing the widgets, and then the social costs would add to that the cost of that guy going to the doctor. Okay, those would be the full social costs. So the full cost to society is this social supply curve right here. That's the full cost to society of providing widgets. Okay, this is the private costs paid by the company, but this is the social costs that includes in it the external costs that are imposed on other people, and that shifts the supply curve up to the social supply curve. And then once you do that, that's going to create a new equilibrium. So we're going to get a new equilibrium. The original equilibrium was P1 Q1. But that was the equilibrium not taking the social costs into account. Okay, so this Q1 here is what we call the private optimum. That's where the firm and the customer will trade. They'll go there right here at Q1 because they do not take external costs into account. So their trading is based on the private supply curve. The social optimum, however, where society wants to be, taking into account the costs that are imposed on other people, taking into account the costs that were imposed on the person who suffered from the pollution and had to go see the doctor, for society as a whole that takes all those costs into account, they're going to be trading according to wanting society to trade according to the social supply curve, which would put us right here at QS. QS meaning that it's the social optimum, and this is the social optimum price. Okay, so the price would be higher than just the market price if we took those external costs into account. So then it would look like this. From QS to Q1, for these units from QS to Q1, those additional units of the good, the costs outweigh the benefits, but it still happens. And that is inefficient. The costs outweigh the benefits, but they still get produced, and it's inefficient. So think about it this way. Think about the demand curve is like it's like a benefit curve, and the supply curve for society as a whole, that's like the social cost curve, right? These are the social costs to society of producing the good. And for these early units of the good, the benefits on the demand curve are greater than the costs on the social cost curve, and so it's efficient to produce it for the next unit. For this, so that was like for the first unit. For the second unit, the benefits on the demand curve outweigh the costs. For the third unit, the benefits outweigh the costs. For the fourth unit, the benefits outweigh the costs. Okay, but right here at QS is where the benefits are now exactly equal to the costs. And any production beyond that, from QS to Q1, the costs to society on the supply curve are greater than the benefits on the demand curve, right? From QS to Q1, the costs outweigh the benefits. But the problem is that the firm and the customer, they will not take that into account. So they're going to trade right here at Q1. That's where they're going to trade. And that's inefficient for society because from QS to Q1, the costs outweigh the benefits, and it's still getting produced. Okay? So that's the inefficiency. That's the problem. That's the market failure that's happening just between QS and Q1. So we are, to use the language of economists, we are overproducing the good relative to the social optimum. When there's a negative externality, you will overproduce the good relative to the social optimum. They will overproduce the good relative to the social optimum. So the question is, what is the solution? Okay? If they are overproducing the good right here, relative, the market will produce here at Q1, that's overproducing the good relative to the social optimum. So the question is, what do we do about that? So the solution that was developed by, let me just move that over there a little bit. The solution that was developed by the economist Arthur Pigou, he developed the idea of what is now called a Pigouvian tax. And that is, set a tax called a Pigouvian tax equal to the amount of the negative externality. Now, remember what a tax does, and if you don't remember, you can go watch my the playlist on tax incidents. What a tax does is, if you place the statutory incidence of the tax on the supplier, then that will shift the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. That will shift the supply curve up by the amount of the tax. And so essentially what will happen is you will take that social supply curve and you will move it up. You'll take the private supply curve, and with a tax that will cause the private supply curve to shift up to where the social supply curve is. It'll cause it to shift up. Now I'm just going to move that back just so we can see both curves at the same time. But what's happening is the private supply curve, if you set a Pigouvian tax equal to the amount of the negative externality, with the negative externality is the distance between the private supply curve and the social supply curve. If you set a tax equal to that, then it will shift that private supply curve up to the social supply curve. And if you do that, that means that the firm and the customer are now going to trade at QS, the social optimum, rather than Q1. So they will no longer overproduce the good relative to the social optimum. Instead of the good getting produced and traded at Q1, society will only trade here at QS, and we have solved our social problem. We've solved our social problem. So notice this. Attacks, we normally think about attacks as creating inefficiencies. You can see that on my tax incidence videos. But a Pigouvian tax is actually increasing efficiency in society. It is getting rid of this problem, because remember, the problem was we overproduced the good relative to the social optimum. From QS to Q1, the costs outweigh the benefits, but it was still happening. That was inefficient if you leave the market to itself. The Pigouvian tax is used to shift up the supply curve, and reduce the quantity from Q1 down to QS and solve the inefficiency problem. We will now be producing at the social optimum. So that's pretty cool. That's a pretty cool solution developed by economists. But of course, every solution creates new costs, and we'll talk about the problems of a Pigouvian tax on another video. All right, this has been Mr. Hagan. Thanks for joining me on another podcast, and we'll see you on the next Econ podcast.